So, in the next talk, we continue today's conversation about freshwater politics. Jim Shultz's presentation takes us back to Bolivia and the time of the Cochabamba water revolt, which is an event that serves as the primary political touchstone for his presentation. The Cochabamba water revolt occurred on April 10th in the year 2000, approximately 7 to 8 years prior to the sequences that were filmed in yesterday's documentary, which shows that the struggle for the control and management of Bolivia's water resources has continued throughout this decade. The recent history of the struggle for Bolivia's water resources, as Jim notes in the introductory chapter to the book, Dignity and Defiance, Stories from Bolivia's Challenge to Globalization, Jim comments that the Cochabamba water revolt has sort of captured the imagination of authors, journalists, policymakers, politicians, activists, and documentarians. But he didn't mention that it's also captured the imagination of Hollywood screenwriters, because you'll remember the film, James Bond film, Quantum of Solace, uses the events in Bolivia in the late 90s and 2000s as inspiration for that story. So it certainly has come into the popular imagination, this event in the history of Bolivia. And then Jim further complicates this story of Bolivia's water resources by talking about glaciers and the disappearance, specifically the disappearance of mountain glaciers in Bolivia. Jim is the founder and executive director of the Democracy Center based in Bolivia. He's based in Bolivia and San Francisco. He's a graduate of UC Berkeley and Harvard University. And he's the author and editor of 3 books, including the award-winning The Democracy Owner's Manual, and, as I just mentioned, Dignity and Defiance, Stories from Bolivia's Challenge to Globalization. He is also author of a variety of major reports on global public health issues, and his articles on globalization issues have appeared in newspapers and magazines across the U.S., Canada, and Europe. His reporting on the Bolivian water revolt was named the top story of 2000 by Project Censored. As a globally recognized expert in citizen advocacy, Shultz has led advocacy training programs for thousands of activists across the U.S., Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. He also has worked as staff to the California legislature, as an advocate with Common Cause and Consumers Union, and has taught public policy at San Francisco State University. Shultz lives with his wife and children in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where he also served for many years as president of an 80-child orphanage. Please join me in welcoming Jim Shultz.
Good morning, everybody. How are you all? Enjoying the cold weather? Well, I'm getting ready for cold weather. I've been in the States now for just over a month, and at 3:35 this afternoon, I take off from Chicago O'Hare and head back to winter in the Southern Hemisphere. So I'll take all the hot weather that I can get. The first thing I want to mention is this word, democracy. I have a bit of an affliction about this word. I've written a book called The Democracy Owner's Manual. I founded and run an organization called the Democracy Center. And a funny thing has happened to that word, democracy, in the last few years. In many parts of the world, it's actually become a dirty word. It's become associated with the imposition of a certain form of government at the point of a gun. And so I think it's really important to define what we mean by democracy. And at the Democracy Center, what we mean is this. Democracy is the right of all people on this planet to understand and to influence the public decisions that shape their lives. And that's the work of the Democracy Center. We work, as Alex said, worldwide. We do a mix of writing and investigations, ranging from a popular blog to a handful of books. Two of those books I brought with me, and Jamie has them, The Democracy Owner's Manual and Dignity and Defiance, and we'll just sort of pass them around the room so you can get a look at them if you like. Don't steal them. I promised Dignity and Defiance to Fred, my last copy. We also do advocacy training around the world. In the last year, I've done advocacy training with UNICEF in Bangkok, with people in the Republic of Georgia, with teenagers in Bolivia. All of these things, including campaigning, are part of our definition of democracy. A couple words of background. I'm a migrant. My family came to the United States about 100 years ago, and just around the 100-year date, I left. I grew up in California, and I moved to Cochabamba, Bolivia. You probably recognize the icons on the California postcard. This little snapshot of Cochabamba, one of the things you see on the hill is we have the tallest statue of Jesus in the world. This is our claim to fame, more than the water vote. When this was built, the people in Rio de Janeiro were very ticked off because they used to have the tallest Jesus in the world. And they got very mad because they said, look, it's got to be 33 meters exactly because Jesus died when he was 33. And the Bolivians said, well, you know, if he was born in December and he died in March or April, he was really 33 y un poco más. And so ours is 33 meters y un poco más. I've lived in Bolivia since 1998. I went there by accident. That's how people become expats. They move to a place for a year and then they don't leave. So my wife and I went there originally to be volunteers in an orphanage. We ended up with 3 Bolivian kids. We went back in 1998 while I was writing a book. And somehow 1998 became 2010, and we're still there. This is the community where I live. This is Tiquipaya. Tiquipaya is a small rural village out in the outskirts of Cochabamba. This is home. This is where I'll be tomorrow. Lucky me. And most of my neighbors are actually Quechua-speaking indigenous farmers. So I'm going to teach a little bit of Quechua this morning. I was going to do the whole presentation in Quechua, but I decided it might be too challenging. So if you repeat after me, Imainaya Kasanki. Imainaya Kasanki. Very good. That's good morning. How are you? I won't teach you any more than that because you'll probably forget that before you leave the room. I'm showing you all this because in a few moments we're going to show you very different images of Cochabamba, and I want to not leave you with the impression that I live in this violent hotbed. I actually live in an extraordinarily beautiful place with extraordinarily beautiful people. This is our festival in Tiquipaya. This is the Festival of San Miguel, in which everybody dances. It's really quite marvelous. This is the video I should have brought instead of a still photo. It happens in October, and everybody dances. I get out of dancing by being the photographer, but my wife and my youngest daughter, who's 7, also dance. So this is Bolivia. It's an extraordinary place. It's urban. It's rural. This valley I live in is 8,000 feet high in the Andes. And it is a place of extraordinary physical beauty and a culture that is alive and vibrant and very, very powerful. Okay, now, because you're teachers, I'm going to eke out a bit of revenge for my K through 12 education in California. Some of you may have picked up a handout with a map on it. Put those away right now. Do not look at them. Put them under your folders. This is not an open book exam. As I tell my daughter, if you have an open book exam, nothing in the book will help you. If you have a take-home exam, nothing in the world will help you. So I have a geography pop quiz. What is wrong with this map? Go ahead, raise your hands. So you think that the projection exaggerates certain countries and diminishes the size of other countries? How many people agree with that? Raise your hands. Which countries are too big? What's that? Yeah, Greenland ain't that big. Which countries are too small on this map? What's that? Southern Hemisphere. Okay, anything else wrong with this map? Yes?
It's upside down.
It's upside down. I could turn the computer upside down. Would that work? No. And why is it upside down? What makes you say that?
It's just a choice that we have and how we look at the globe.
And it definitely gives the advantage to the people who are higher up. We talk about going down south and going up north. A lot of people have a problem with that, and some people prefer an upside-down map, which looks right side up if you're looking at the global south. What else is wrong with this map? What else makes this map a misrepresentation of the way the world really is? As Fred talked about, discovering that the maps that he looked at as a youth no longer reflected the full borders of the rivers and the seas. What else is missing? Yes, in the back. You can't see Antarctica. That's right. Maybe this is a post-glacier apocalypse map. Yes. And this was the answer I was looking for. Because what I want to talk about in terms of Bolivia and in terms of these stories is what it means to live in a world with disappearing borders. And specifically because you are teachers, what does it mean to prepare a generation of children and youth to come of age in a world in which the borders of this earth, those lines on the map, are disappearing in dramatic and important ways? I like to think of the last 20 years as the age of the dotted line, in which the borders were sort of there and sort of not. For the last 20 years, or for the last 10 years, I've been documenting in Bolivia something called economic globalization. There's a reason that people equate that with Bolivia. For 20 years, in the 80s and the 90s, Bolivia was the poster child in Latin America for a set of economic reforms known as the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal economic model, the University of Chicago plan. There were two countries in Latin America that really led the way. One was Chile, which did it as a dictatorship, and the other was Bolivia, which did it as a democracy. And this was a world of dotted lines in which, on the one hand, countries were sovereign and certainly had governments that could make their own choices, but were under a form of economic pressure to make those choices in a way that really erased a part of their sovereignty. And that brings us to the first story of the day, the Cochabamba water revolt. It's a very different image than the ones I showed you earlier, isn't it? This is about a block from my office in Cochabamba. This is April of 2000 on the street. And this is the story of the water revolt. In April, well, actually at the end of 1999, an announcement was made in Bolivia that the public water system of the city of Cochabamba, a city of 500,000 people, was to be privatized, leased for 40 years, into the hands of a mysterious company that no one had ever heard of, Aguas del Tunari. The company took its name from this beautiful 15,000-foot mountain peak on the edge of our valley. And the announcement took people by surprise. So first, let's talk about what we might call, to borrow a phrase, the deciders. The decision to privatize the water system of Cochabamba, to be clear, was not a decision democratically taken by the people. The people were not consulted. The people did not have a vote. The people were not aware of the details of the deal. It was simply announced. It was an arrangement worked out behind closed doors by three actors. The first is the World Bank. A little bit of history here. The World Bank was formed in the closing days of World War II, along with the International Monetary Fund and the United Nations, as part of a global vision of how the countries of the world, after a decade of war, could come together and begin to solve their problems collectively. The UN was supposed to prevent outbreaks of war, and the World Bank and the IMF were given the economic task of trying to prevent another Great Depression. And the World Bank had a very specific mission, and that was to put together large sums of money and to finance large infrastructure projects, and specifically the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. In the 1980s, when the reconstruction of Europe had pretty much been finished, it looked for something else to do, and that happened just as we had Ronald Reagan in power in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in power in Britain, in which they were imposing an economic philosophy in public policy that was very much a sort of market fundamentalist policy, that the size of government should shrink, regulations on businesses should be erased, and the corporate sector in particular should be given much more license to operate in the world, and that would lift all boats. And they thought, this is a really excellent idea, and we should export it. We should export it particularly to developing countries. And one of the key missionaries, in the same way that Jesuits and Franciscans carried the gospel centuries before to Latin America, the World Bank carried the gospel of Thatcherism and Reaganism, and they called it the Washington Consensus, and they brought it to countries like Bolivia. Now, they didn't bring it as a suggestion. They didn't bring it as an analysis. They brought it in the way, let's see, how many of you have teenagers? Raise your hand. How many of you were teenagers? Raise your hand. How many of you are teenagers? Raise your hand. Think about the relationship that a teenager has with her parents around an allowance. Those of you who got an allowance when you're, or those of you who give an allowance to your teenager, raise your hand again. Does your kid have to do anything for that allowance? What's that? I'm sorry, say it again? Okay. Who else? Who has chores that they assign to their kids? What chore what does your kid have to do? Mowing the lawn, washing the dishes. Well, if you understand the relationship between parents and adolescents and allowance, you basically understand the relationship between a country like Bolivia and the World Bank, which is privatize your water or no dinner. In this case, privatize your water, the World Bank said in 1997, specifically privatize the water systems of Cochabamba and La Paz and El Alto, or we will not renew a package of loans to expand water service in your country. And just as the teenager grudgingly washes the dishes or mows the lawn or, I should say in Chicago, shovels the walk, the government of Bolivia dutifully followed these commands one after another, privatizing every state enterprise, oil, gas, the airline, the train system, all of it. And then in 1999, the World Bank came calling for water. The government of Bolivia at that time was headed by this very handsome gentleman in the middle with the fancy uniform, Hugo Banzer Suarez. Hugo Banzer Suarez in the 1970s was Bolivia's Pinochet. He was a dictator. I didn't fully realize until actually this year what it meant to live under a dictatorship. I'll share this story with you. It's important. A friend of mine, a Bolivian named Ismail, decided for the anniversary of the return of democracy this year to create an art exhibit in which he recreated a torture chamber. The exact same torture chamber he was put in as a college student. The same electrodes, the same dunking booth. And they took a group of 20 young people, including my staff, and they recreated what it meant to be detained by the police and shoved into a closet big enough for 2 people when you were 15, and to be yelled at, and to be pulled out, and to be threatened. And as I was walking through this exhibit, another friend of mine, an academic named Roberto Fernandez Terán, who I've known for a decade, turned to me and he said, for the first time, they did it to me. This was our president in Bolivia again in 2000, who returned as a Democrat, elected with 23% of the vote through a manipulated election. And when the World Bank knocked on his door, he obeyed the orders, and in a process with just one bidder, this mysterious company, the water was handed over with a 40-year lease to this mysterious corporation, Aguas del Chinare, which we researched during the water vote and discovered was actually a very familiar name from the same town as me, the Bechtel Corporation. How many of you have heard of the Bechtel Corporation? What do you know about them? Yeah. Is it a big company? $18 billion a year. Built Hoover Dam. Built the Big Dig in Boston. And alongside Halliburton was one of 2 companies given a no-bid contract by the Bush administration for the reconstruction of Iraq. It was a huge corporation. It is a huge corporation. And so one of the questions you might ask is, why on earth does an $18 billion a year corporation want to take over a $6 million a year public water company in Cochabamba? Ever play Monopoly? What are those first 2 properties when you first pass go? They cost like $10, and if somebody lands on them with a hotel, maybe you get 20. They're really cheap. Like Baltic Avenue, right? But you buy them anyway. And why do you buy them? Because you want to get in the game. Bechtel wanted to get in the game, and Cochabamba was Baltic Avenue, and it went on the market, and they bought it. What were the arguments for privatization? Let's be clear, they're very strong arguments. One, skilled management. The fact is that Cochabamba's public water system was a mess. It was corrupt, it was mismanaged, it was inefficient. Its rate structure was a mess. This was not some glorious public company. This was a mess. And the argument for privatization was, look, we know how to manage water companies. That's what we do. So you bring us in and we will figure this out. We will uproot the corruption. We will manage it like a real company. It's a very strong argument. Number 2, technical expertise. We know water systems. We are engineers. We are technicians. Our company knows how to do this. Bring us in and we will solve the technical problems. Cochabamba is a city that has doubled in population in less than 20 years. That is a lot of infrastructure. We have whole communities of ex-miners who have moved to Cochabamba as a community. I remember I visited one of these communities after the water revolt with one of the leaders, and it was their festival, and everybody was drunk. And I'm in this little tiny room with all these drunk ex-miners, and I forget, some guy walks in, he goes, "Compañeros!" And he says, if they don't listen to us, we still know how to use these. And he had a stick of dynamite in his hand. You don't want to hang out with a drunk guy with a stick of dynamite. Just a little FYI. So the argument was skilled management, technical expertise, and investment. You know, people like to say, God gives us the water and nobody should get in the middle. And James Briscoe, an economist at the World Bank, said, well, God forgot to lay the pipe. And so it requires investment. These were the arguments, and they were very strong arguments. Now let's talk about the reality. First of all, and I really was quite stunned by this, I was stunned by the fact that I was not stunned that the Bolivian government would lie. I was quite stunned at how ably both the World Bank and the Bechtel Corporation would just lie about the facts. World Bank lied that it had had its hand in the privatization until we uncovered a World Bank document which actually described how they had coerced the privatization. Shortly after the water revolt, a spokeswoman for the Bechtel Corporation declared, for the poorest people in Cochabamba, rates went up a little, barely 10%. So I went and started scanning before and after water bills, and then I managed to get into, I got access to the database in the actual water company's computers and was able to work with their people to do a calculation of what the rate increases actually were using Bechtel's own data after the water revolt. The average increase was 51% overnight. Overnight. How would you feel if your electric bill went up 51% overnight? Would you be happy campers? I don't think so. The average rate for the very poorest, we're talking about people who, if they're lucky, make $60 a month. That's the minimum wage at the time. 43%. I interviewed this woman, Tanya Paredes. Her water bill, she's a knitter of baby clothing. She made maybe $100 a month at the time. Her increase was $15. She told me her increase was equal to what it took to feed her family for 10 days. What we pay for water comes out of what we have to pay for food, clothes, and other things we need to buy for our children. One of the things I learned in this research is this gap between the way the World Bank and the IMF see the world and the way in which it all comes out on the ground. I have a graduate degree from Harvard. I did a consultancy for the World Bank. I've spent time with them. I've worked in that building. And I learned a profound lesson, which is in the bank, in the IMF, they live in a world of theory. They live in a world where they believe they know what's happening on the ground based on having read pieces of paper written by other people who have the same education that they do. And the gap between theory and reality can be extraordinary, and there is no better example of the gap between theory and reality on the water revolt. Skilled management, these were people who sat in a 5-star hotel and watched as people were shedding blood in the streets over these rate increases, and all they could do was send faxes to the TV station saying, we're not leaving. You know, I've never been a corporate manager, but I'm going to make a guess here that if I were a corporate manager and I got kicked out within 4 months of being in a country, that would not lead my CV. Technical expertise. There were, first of all, it's not rocket science to drill wells and lay tube in a place like Cochabamba. It's not like you need a graduate degree from MIT to figure it out. And there was lots of technical expertise available, locally and internationally, for free, from people who work with water systems in Canada and the United States. There was no reason on earth that people in the poorest country of South America had to pay Bechtel for it, and needed investment. Bechtel signed a contract that guaranteed them an annual rate of return of 16% per year. If anybody here knows where I can get an annual rate of return of 16%, please see me afterwards. I have a kid in college. It was theft. The reaction. People stopped paying their water bills. That was reaction number one. And the company said, if you don't pay your water bills, we will cut off your water. Then people took to the streets. In January of 2000, they shut down the city for 2 days. A city of 500,000 people, no cars, no schools open, nothing. It was a general strike, and it had absolute broad support, rural and urban. And they demanded that the rates be rolled back. And the government response in February was to say you could no longer protest, and they brought in 1,200 police from across the country and began shooting. That was in February of 2000. Then the people started what they called in April the ultimate battle, la batalla final. And they said, we're not backing down until the contract is canceled. I've told this story so many times, and so many people have come to Bolivia, and so many people have done master's theses and doctor's dissertations and documentaries, and nothing I can say will communicate to you what it was like to live in a war zone in which I told you who this guy was, the president. He was capable of anything. He arrested the leaders of the water revolt and put them on a plane and sent them to a jail in the jungle. He declared martial law. There was a curfew. I could not go out after 9 o'clock at night. We would have to have clandestine meetings. I took phone calls all night from my friends who were telling me, the police are at Oscar's mother's house, knocking the door down, they're looking for him. We tried to figure out every night where people could hide that night. And on the day that martial law was declared in Cochabamba by the government to do nothing more than protect Bechtel's contract, I was the only person writing about this story from Cochabamba. It wasn't because I was smart, I just by complete circumstance was there. And as I was about ready to send out this international story about martial law, the stupid lights in my house went out, which begat a little discussion between me and my wife about recharging the laptop. And then I went outside and I realized that the lights in my whole block went out. It was when I realized that the lights in the entire northern half of the city had been taken out that I realized what had happened. The government had shut down all the electricity in the northern half of the city to take out the television towers and the radio towers. That's what people face down. This is a very powerful image. People often talk about the water revolt as David and Goliath, and there's nothing quite so literal as this image. They fought off soldiers with a sling. Look at this woman. This is David with braids and a skirt, but this is David and Goliath. And the reason the story is so powerful is because David won. The company was forced to leave. Imagine the courage that this woman had. These people had live bullets. They killed a 17-year-old boy with a shot to the face. I know his mother. I got shot at. I didn't like that too much. We have always repeated those slogans, death to the World Bank, death to the IMF, down with Yankee imperialism. But I believe that this is the first time that the people understood in a direct way how the policies of the World Bank, free trade, free markets, is putting us at such a disadvantage among the most powerful countries. Oscar Oliveira, one of the leaders of the water revolt. I don't know who it was that said this. Maybe, Fred, it was you yesterday who said, if we don't have oil, people can survive. People can survive with almost anything. You can't survive without water. That's what triggered this. It was about water. To wrap up the story, a couple things. First of all, a little like in Star Wars, the Empire, in this case, Bechtel struck back. A year after the water revolt, Bechtel announced that it was filing a $50 million legal case. A $50 million legal case against the people of Bolivia. That's an amount equal to run the water company for about 6 or 7 years. Not to recover the money that they had lost. They invested $1 million. That's how much they invested. I have that documented from the company. But because the international trade system allowed them to sue Bolivia for the profits they would have made and weren't allowed to. And What was the venue for this case? Was it a civil court in Bolivia? Nope. Was it an open court in the United States? Nope. It was a trade tribunal at the World Bank, the same institution that had coerced the privatization to begin with, in a trade court so secret that the people of Bolivia were not allowed to know who would testify, what they said, where the hearing would be held, or when it would be held. So we mounted a little campaign globally. We decided that the way to fight this case was not with lawyers, but was to go after Bechtel's public reputation, to hang the water revolt around their neck a second time until it hurt so much they would give up. I love this as a little picture that accompanied an article that I wrote for the New Internationalist. This is a magazine in Britain. This is Riley Bechtel, the CEO, flying around on his little airplane. People shut down Bechtel's headquarters with direct action in San Francisco. We filed a legal petition in the case with the World Bank, more than 300 organizations from 43 countries. People went to the CEO's house in Washington and had a chat with his neighbors. He really liked that. And in January of 2006, the Bechtel Corporation announced that it was settling the case for a token payment of 30 cents, not $50 million. I asked the lawyer for the Bolivian government at the time of the settlement, why did they really cave in? And he said, I know why they caved in. The lawyers told me. Riley Bechtel, the CEO, personally intervened and told them to make the case go away. And that's what they did. The story of the water revolt isn't over, and I'm always very rigorous in being quite honest about it, because the question is, well, how's water now? And the answer is the water system in Cochabamba, which is once again a public system, is terrible. It is still corrupt, it is still mismanaged, and there are still a lot of people in Cochabamba who have no water. And that's been 10 years. It's made some improvements, but not what people want. So the logical question is, well, wouldn't people have been better off with a corporation? And again, I think Fred made this point yesterday. Public management, private management, there is no angel here. There's plenty of examples of bad public management, especially in developing countries. That is not an argument to turn people's water over to corporations, because at the end of the day, and this is my belief, the only real solution to who controls water is that it has to be controlled in a democratic process. Ultimately, the people have to have control of their water. So you could say, well, boy, this public water company is still a mess. But you know what? People can make demands of the public water company and they don't get shot for it. That's a big improvement. I'm not a theologian on the issue of privatization. I don't believe that I don't really care a whole lot whether the guys in my street who are putting tubes in the ground have the logo of a public company on their vests or a private company. The issue is what privatization means in practical terms, and this is important. What it means in the way the World Bank does it, it means, A, market pricing for water. You cannot charge poor people the full cost of their water. It doesn't work. In Illinois, you're not making low-income people pay the full actual cost for their phone service, for their electricity, or for their water. I'm sure that Illinois, like pretty much every other state, certainly my home state of California, has lifeline rates that subsidize the cost of basic necessities. That's not what the World Bank believes in. The World Bank believes in market pricing of water, that the full cost needs to be borne by the users. It doesn't work for low-income people. And second, it is about the taking away of social control. Ultimately, people have to be able to influence. I talked to a man who was the head of his pueblo who marched during the water revolt some 60 kilometers to Cochabamba. Imagine that. And I asked him why he walked that far to join the protest. And he said, because I know that if a foreign corporation a hemisphere away gets control of our water, we will never have any influence over what happens. So what I'm saying here is the struggle to improve water systems, to control them, to make them serve the people is bigger than just taking corporations out of the picture. That's the beginning. It's not the end. You still have to build the system that you want. I want to switch gears here for a minute. Now, what do we do in a world where there are no borders at all? And to illustrate this, I want to show you a little video.
They say that climate change will affect us all. They say that poor countries like Bolivia will suffer more than others, even though they're not responsible for causing most global warming. They say that in La Paz and El Alto, Bolivia's largest dual city that blooms under the eye of Mount Illimani, water will soon be so scarce that it will have to be rationed. But on the other side of Illimani, there are people and communities who already know what climate change looks like.
Hasta el fondo, hasta donde hay carretera, eso todo blanco eso. Cuando me niñez que tengo 8 años, y ahora hay sitio nomás ya hay. De eso nosotros preocupamos mucho, con que cuando no va a haber esa agua, con que cero, de otro lado cero no nomás ya es.
Si hablamos de derechos y hablamos del derecho también al decidir libremente sobre la vida de uno, estos efectos están afectando fundamentalmente, o estos fenómenos están afectando fundamentalmente estos derechos básicos, ¿no?
El causante no somos nosotros con todo el indigno originario siempre hemos tenido.
Bolivia, home to 20% of the world's tropical glaciers, is watching its mountaintops melt away. The glacier Chacaltaya, which only 3 years ago was still the highest ski slope in the world, has vanished completely. The Development Research Institute estimates that glaciers in the Cordillera Real mountain range east of La Paz lost 40% of their volume between 1975 and 2006. The ice on Mount Illimani is melting even more rapidly due to its high altitude. The glacier provides water to numerous communities, among them the indigenous community of Capi, a village of 40 families that sits nestled in a green valley directly below the mountain.
Ahora nosotros pensamos, ¿no? Por ahí también nuestro glaciar puede desaparecer en 15 años porque si no reducen sus gases los países desarrollados, ¿no? Si es que van a reducir, por ahí va a aguantar más o menos 40 años, ¿no? ¿Quién sabe, no?
The melting of Illimani's glacier and the erratic weather caused by global warming is already producing tangible consequences that affect the livelihoods of innumerable families.
El tiempo ya está cambiando. Ahí, por ejemplo, antiguamente llovía toda una semana, así despacito llovía. Yo he visto, por ejemplo, en Suecia, está lloviendo así, despacito. Yo he dicho, antiguamente en mi país así llovía, yo he dicho, al ingeniero yo le he explicado. Ahora, ¿cómo llueve en aquí? 2 horas nomás llueve. Llueve tremendo, con tormentas, con granizos. Arrasa nuestros cultivos también, ¿no?
No tienen tampoco manera de prever, como tenían antes, las épocas en las que era adecuado sembrar, cosechar, en fin. Entonces toda esta variación climática está provocando pérdidas.
Con ese cultivo que vivimos nosotros no da para ganar, ¿no? Hay mayoría de las familias trabajan solamente para abastecerse a su familia porque tienen 5 o 6 hijos, entonces no da para vender, poco llevan a la ciudad de La Paz para vender, ¿no?
Es agua dulce, ¿no? Para tomar, para producir, al menos todo lo que va de la cordillera occidental ahí, eso nos alimenta, eso es nuestra agua, ¿no? Entonces si no tenemos glaciales, se ha deshielado todo y vamos a tener agua. Entonces, ¿qué vamos a tomar?
But the loss of water is not the only thing at stake, and glaciers are not just blocks of ice. The melting of Illimani's glacier threatens the basis of what has sustained Indian spirituality and traditions for centuries.
Es como un Dios para nosotros, ¿no? Es como decir el Tatasajama, es un grande. Pues nosotros hablamos con los cerros.
Dicen, oh Ilimán, Achachila, dicen. Achachila, hoy día dame pues fuerzas para trabajar, dicen, ¿no? En la mañanita, ¿no? Dame fuerzas para trabajar, dicen. El mediodía también ya agradecen, ¿no? Gracias Achachila, hoy día estoy comido. Así nuestros abuelos agradecían.
Nosotros, por ejemplo, para sembrar, nos pedimos un respeto del Pachamama, de nuestras vacas. Un cerdo tiene nombre, ¿no? Tal nombre, ¿no? Para que haya buena cosecha, después que siembra, para que producir que venga el lluvia, ¿no? A través de nuestros cerros.
But for many, it is becoming more and more difficult to maintain centuries-old traditions.
Pero ahora ya, por falta de agua, los jóvenes ya se van a la ciudad de La Paz, allá se quedan a trabajar, después regresan ya con otro pensamiento, ya se han olvidado sus costumbres.
Y ahora, eso nosotros, ¿con qué agua nos vamos a llegar? ¿De qué vamos a vivir? ¿Y nuestros hijos con qué? Estas plantitas, si no puede ser esa agua, ¿qué podemos hacer? De eso se han ido a la ciudad, a otros lugares se han ido.
The relationship that these communities maintain with the earth that supports them lays the basis for an alternative model of resource development, one that holds valuable lessons for people who live in cities and industrialized environments.
Es una comunicación con la tierra y el hombre, ¿no? A veces este modelo no entiende. Todos meterle tractor y meterlo puro químicos, tecnología, pero no hay esa comunicación.
Para mí el tema clave es ir a romper un paradigma con el cual ha vivido la humanidad en los últimos siglos y romperlo para crear uno que sea más amistoso entre los hombres y las mujeres y entre los hombres y las mujeres con la naturaleza. Ojalá.
The issues of the water war are almost being rendered moot. Who cares really who's building and controlling the pipes if there's no more water to put through them? This is an image, a set of 4 images of the Chacaltaya Glacier. This was once the highest elevation ski resort in the world. The glacier is now gone. It's gone completely, the Chacaltaya Glacier. And the tropical glaciers of Bolivia are melting as a result of global warming. Who knows what these images are? This one on the left, who recognizes that image? Yes? The Berlin Wall. And the one in the middle? Who knows what that one is? That's the wall the United States is building on the border between Mexico and the United States. And the last image, the one on the right, that's the wall that Israel is building in the Gaza Strip to separate it from the Palestinians. As the borders of the world erase, nations are building walls to either keep in or keep out what they want or what they don't want. Where's the wall Bolivia gets to build to protect itself from climate change? Can't build one. It didn't create this crisis, but it is living more harshly than almost any country in the world with the results. Not in theory, not in the future, but right now. This is La Paz, with the Illimani behind it. La Paz and El Alto, their water depends on the glaciers. The glaciers are essentially frozen reservoirs. Their reservoirs are melting. This is the largest urban area in the country. What the hell are they going to do for water when the glaciers are gone? And they didn't do it. They didn't do it. This video on climate change, or on the glaciers, it's on YouTube. It's something you can use with your students. It's one of the reasons that we produced it. If we look today at the Gulf, I mean, how many more messages do we need to get that the way in which we're living on this planet does not work? And what we are doing, whether it's in Bolivia or in the Gulf or anywhere, we are engaged in a form of theft that we've never been engaged in before, which is sometimes we don't treat workers in our country well, but they can organize unions and fight back. Sometimes we don't treat other countries well, and they can organize and communicate. The people from whom we are stealing right now are the children and the children who will follow them. We are creating a society and a culture on water and many other issues based on the direct theft from what the world will be like when my 7-year-old daughter comes of age and when her daughter comes of age after that. That is what's at stake. And that is why you, as teachers, you have such a fundamental role. I pulled this quote out. I always used to apply this to my mom and dad. You know, my mom and dad were married on September 7th, 1941. 3 months to the day afterwards, Pearl Harbor happened. And my dad went into the Navy. And we talk about that generation so much in our culture, of a generation, as Franklin Roosevelt said, that had a rendezvous with destiny. Well, guess what? The generation that's in their 20-somethings now and the generation behind that, the kids sitting in your classroom, they have a rendezvous with destiny. They have a burden that we didn't have. This world, in terms of water especially, could look so fundamentally different in 20 or 30 years if we don't act. That's why your job as educators is so profoundly and fundamentally important. And you're educating this generation in a sea of propaganda. You know, I feel like a Rip Van Winkle. You know, I come back to this country after 10 years. These are 3 little slogans I picked up watching television this month. I've been in the United States. They're not advertising products. They're co-opting values. It's time to fight for what you believe by buying a Mazda. Let freedom ring by signing up with Verizon Wireless. These are real slogans. Chase what matters. What people need to believe in is protecting the planet. The freedom they need is freedom from the calamity that's coming from us. And what matters is not what ATM you use. We need to educate a generation of activists. I love this picture. This is do you know folks know 350.org? Anybody familiar with them? They pulled off the largest global activism event last October in the history of the world. In 5,000 places in 130 countries, they got people to form art, to put in some way this number in the public consciousness of 350. 350 parts per million is the maximum amount of carbon that NASA scientists say that this planet can deal with. It's the temperature. It's the speed limit. We're at 392 now. We need to develop this generation and their ability to understand. It is about informed democracy. They need to understand the issue, and they need to believe that they can make a difference, and they need to be given the opportunity to make a difference. And that is your challenge. Thank you all very much for your attention. We'll take some questions, but 2 last things. You know, one is you're doing God's work, as we say. And Jamie, would you come up here? I have a present for you. This cover of our book, Dignity and Defiance, this was painted by a friend of ours, an artist, Valentina Campos, who lives in my village in Tiquipaya. And these are a set of cards also painted by her for you. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, with whatever time is left from my rambling, fire away.
Yeah, early on in your talk, you mentioned, and then later, that the water in your town, the infrastructure and everything is bad and it's poorly managed, etc. And then you went through we saw the sort of violence, and it's still that way. My question is, I'm guessing prices are manageable for people. Why don't they get out in the streets and demonstrate against the poor management, the corruption, and so on? And therefore, World Bank and Bechtel would never need to be involved because it wouldn't be an issue.
They've actually done something more interesting than protest. In the southern parts of the city where water is scarce and where infrastructure is more scarce, people have formed water cooperatives. In other words, they believe in community solutions. So they are, whether it's digging wells or other sort of water sharing or rooftop rain collection, they're trying to build a water system from the ground up. And one of the negotiations, for example, with the public water company is the public water company would really like to be hooked up to them and make them ratepayers. And they're saying, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll buy it from you in bulk, but we're going to control the distribution system. So what's actually very hopeful and interesting in Cochabamba is not, how are they doing in terms of taking over the public water company, but constructing a community-based alternative, which on the one hand has real potential to work, but is undermined in the way everything in Bolivia is undermined in terms of water by the fact that there's less water available because of the impact of climate change. If you're interested, if you go to our website, there's actually a video that we produced on these water cooperatives. I think that's where the hope is in Cochabamba, is people taking water into their own hands at a community level. And I think we've heard that message over and over again in this conference, is our solutions are not necessarily big enterprises. A lot of our solutions are local and democratically controlled and low tech. And that's where you see the energy being put in Cochabamba as opposed to more protest. Yes?
Yes, please. For me, it's easier to understand how to solve problems in a small city like yours, or a small village like yours. But the image you painted about La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, is rather scary. If most of their water comes from glaciers, are there any contingency plans to address the situation as the glaciers are rapidly disappearing?
There are proposals, but no plans. And it's because of money. There are ideas and proposals of what needs to do, but they all cost substantial sums of money. And a country that doesn't have a lot of extra money to spend. And I mean, one of the things that has to happen is the glacier melt needs to be captured and not just sort of run off and be gone. I mean, there are ways to address this and adapt to it. It's not going to make La Paz whole. It's not going to prevent El Alto, its sister city, from being damaged. But again, the question is who finances this, which gets into why Bolivia is pushing so hard in UN climate negotiations for what it calls a climate debt, that the countries of the north that have created climate change need to really amp up their financing for adaptation projects and to not do it through the World Bank or the IMF, which is the way wealthy countries tend to like to do things. If you're interested in this, there's an excellent article and a video that the New York Times produced about 4 or 5 months ago. If you go to the New York Times website and you do a search for La Paz, you ought to come up right away with that. They did a very nice analysis of what it would take. It's an excellent piece. Yes?
Any other questions?
Oh, come on, you must have more questions.
You know, I was thinking as I was watching the presentation how the people in Bolivia value the water resource in a different way than we do and our students do, because I didn't grow up hearing about a water bill the way that I hear about an electricity bill or, other bills that we pay. And I don't know how many people in this room think very often about how much you pay for water. In some, it's becoming more prevalent in some states in our country, but I think a lot of people don't. And then it gets to that question of what does it take before people start speaking up in our country about the value of the resource. It's hard to get our students to really understand, how critical the scarcity issue is when they're not hearing about the lack of water. Like, why take the shorter shower? You know, why test your toilet by putting the drop of food dye in the tank to see if it leaks through and see if you know, why do all those things when they're not even thinking about the cost? So I don't know. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Anybody ever hear the story about the 2 ways to boil a frog? You know, one way is you put on a pot of hot water and you wait till it's, you know, really boiled, and you toss the frog in it. And I've never tried this. My daughter probably won't let me. But in theory, the frog jumps out of the hot boiling water because the frog's not that stupid. Then there's the sly way, which is you take a pot of cold water, you put the frog in it, and you heat up to a boil real slow. Bolivia is like the frog that's being boiled in hot water. They get water shortage. They get climate change because it's real and in their lives. And, you know, when Enron stole $35 billion from the ratepayers of my home state, California, people didn't do anything about it except elect Arnold Schwarzenegger governor, which didn't really change a lot. People in Cochabamba, their rates went up a little tiny bit, and they flipped out, and they shut down their city. So I think the lesson here is the United States is not, we are not protected from these. We like to believe that at the end of the day our affluence protects us from things, but we know too well from our own lives that's not always the case. And we're like the frog in a pot of cold water getting boiled slow. And the sooner we figure that out, and the sooner your students figure that out, the sooner we're going to figure out a way to get out of that pot. And that's the lesson from Bolivia, I think. They're the canary in the cage for the rest of us. ¿Algo más?
This is getting a little far afield, but I want to know if the Democracy Center is dealing with the situation in El Salvador where the Canadian mining companies are literally killing off the animals, etc., and now suing El Salvador because they don't want them there. So is there some way we can get actively involved with that as a public?
Well, I'm honest, I did not plant this question. One of the first things I did when I got to the United States this last month was I facilitated an all-day strategy session for groups from El Salvador and their solidarity groups here on this case. This is a case called the Pacific Rim case, where a community, Las Cabañas in El Salvador, doesn't want a gold mine to open up operations because it will pollute the water with arsenic, and it's their children's water. And so they've managed to get the Salvadoran government to not issue the permits. And so this gold mine, this gold mining company, Pacific Rim in Canada, is following the exact same path that Bechtel did in suing the government of El Salvador for $70 million in the exact same trade court at the World Bank. And we're organizing a campaign to put pressure on the company. If you're interested, go to the Democracy Center homepage, and right on the homepage is actually I can pull it up. Hold on. Oh, it'll be too hard. No. Go to the Democracy Center homepage, and you'll see a link to something called the Network for Justice and Global Investment, which has a lot of information on that. One last question?
I was wondering if you could reflect on what the lessons might be for conflict resolution and for conflict prevention. Conflict resolution from the case in Cochabamba, and conflict prevention in the case of Melting Glaciers in La Paz.
It's interesting, you know, a lot of foreigners have come to Bolivia preaching the gospel of conflict resolution, and they haven't been well received because sometimes Bolivians take that as, oh, you're here to make us, to pacify us and keep us from fighting for our rights. Conflict resolution should not be a call for people to not have conflicts. Do you all remember Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail? It's one of the most powerful documents you can ever share with your students about what it means to act in a nonviolent way. And he said, look, he wrote in that document, I'm in jail. And he wrote it to his critics. And it's because sometimes we have to create conflict, because it is the only thing that will get a community to pay attention and the only thing that will force power to negotiate. So the question is, how do you keep that conflict from becoming violent? Conflict is not a bad thing. Violent conflict is a bad thing. And in the case of Cochabamba, the people didn't make it violent. It got violent when they were going to have a peaceful protest. It got violent when the government said, you do not have the right to have a peaceful protest. And therefore, we're going to bring in 1,200 police from other cities because your police won't shoot at you, and they will, and we're going to prevent your right to peaceful protest. That's conflict. So some of it is, holding governments accountable for the violence that they provoke, all governments, including the government of this country. And, I don't know what else to say. When it comes to glaciers and the melting glaciers, we're going to, any time you put people in a situation of scarcity, there's going to be conflict. And we're headed for a world in which water is going to become an extremely scarce resource if we don't deal with it. And that means the scarcity of other things. So, it's a security issue. And it's going to be a security issue first in the poorest countries of the world. And at the end of the day, the United States is going to get pulled into these things. So maybe that will wake people up if they don't care about melting glaciers. Maybe they care about conflict.
Any final comments or questions? Okay, we'll do one more as they finish setting up the lunch.
I always love answering questions when the smell of the food starts to permeate the room. And people go, just hurry up.
I try and have hope and rise above frustration. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I saw a report about 5 years ago that shocked me, and it was how the United States will change in regard to global warming, and it was recommendations for corporations on what to buy and what to sell and how to change. And I don't know if you're aware of this. I find it more than disheartening, and if you would speak to that if you know anything about it. It's beyond our control, I always feel. So give me some hope.
Well, anybody want to place bets on the number of meetings being held in corporate boardrooms with PowerPoint presentations offering up where there are new economic opportunities? My friend Naomi Klein, the Canadian author who some of you may have heard of, has quite a litany of explanations of all the ways in which the Canadian corporate community sees how they're going to benefit big time, from climate change. They're going to have new ag land, new resorts, new routes. They're going to be winners as well as losers. It's going to redistribute water in ways that are going to hurt a lot of people and help others. I don't think we can allow that to happen. I just don't think we can allow it to happen. And so, look, at the end of the day, I think our challenge is to do three things all at once. One is to take responsibility in our personal lives for how we use water, of how we use energy. And, we just all have to do that. None of us, I think, have the full integrity we can find. I certainly don't. And I think that's just, we all have to be more conscious. And we all know it's not nearly enough. We have to act in our communities. Some of the responses that we have to do are really community-based, but let's not forget that ultimately we have to change the behavior of large numbers of people very fast in very deep ways. And the only tool on the planet that can do that is public policy. And so we're going to have to understand what we have to demand of our governments. And we're going to have to take global warming and climate change and make it a front burner issue instead of a back burner. And how you do that is complicated, but, that's not rocket science. We figured out how to push governments before, and we can figure out how to push them on this.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Jim Shultz.
Thank you all. Good luck with your students.